Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm here with Ethan Muse and Jeremy Christiansen. Jeremy has been on the show before. It's been a while since I've had you on, actually. We talked about Mormonism and your book that came out not too long ago. I say not too long ago. It probably has been a long time at this point. But you are a lawyer. You're an ex-Mormon, and just an all-around pretty cool guy. And you also post on X. What is your X handle? Remind me again. Isn't it like
Tradvat2?
There you go. Yeah, you guys. I want you to like literally, if you're interested in Mormonism, you're interested in LDS stuff, then go follow Jeremy on his X, and then Ethan Muse. I think a lot of people getting more familiar with Ethan these days. He's done quite a few debates. He was on Matt Fradd's show recently. But the reason why we're here this evening is to sort of review the debate that was hosted a couple nights ago between Ethan and Luke Hanson on whether or not was the Book of Mormon demonically inspired. Is it more likely? Actually, because we wanted to talk about the proposition. Let me read the exact proposition, then we'll talk about it. It is more likely that the Book of Mormon was inspired by demons than by God. That was the exact proposition. So we made a clarification at the very beginning and an email, like before all of this was set up, that this was not committing Ethan to the view or like to having to basically demonstrate that it was demons, right? All he's arguing, this is like a contrastive type of proposition. So you're basically just saying that of these two options, it's more likely that the first option is the real one, right? So Ethan actually gave a good analogy earlier, and maybe you can just give it, and I can turn it over to you, Ethan. The rain and the snow analogy, I think it would help people.
Yeah. So when you're just saying it's more likely demons than God that inspired the book, it would be like saying it's more likely that it's going to rain tomorrow than that it's going to snow tomorrow, which is totally compatible with the true answer being that it's neither going to rain nor snow, that it's going to be clear skies tomorrow. So really all we're asking is the pattern of facts that we have more consistent with demons or more consistent with God? So if a bunch of stuff that we see is what we would expect from demons, and then a bunch of stuff that we see is what we wouldn't expect from God, regardless of whether we actually believe that demons were involved or were purely natural, we would conclude that I had carried the burden to prove the prompt. In fact, just because it's about how likely it is, it's about likelihood, we could just win it on the prior probability alone. So we could just win it on, if demons inspire more books than God, then we just need, however, so let's say it's 1,000 times more common for there to be a false prophet than a true prophet. Well, then, unless the opponent shows us that basically his evidence is 1,000 times better than mine for it's from God, then just on the prior, we would conclude it's more likely demons than God if we're not presupposing either worldview. So those are two key points about the prompt, is it's not arguing for demons, it's just saying, look, let's assume something supernatural took place here. Is that more likely demons or is it likely than God? And second, since it's just a question of bare probabilities, we can go purely based on priors.
Jeremy, when we were speaking on the phone earlier, you also mentioned that you weren't necessarily sold on the proposition, but what about with this clarification? Like, do you think that the arguments that Ethan presented, do you think that they convinced you that of these two options, that demons is more likely?
Yeah, no, certainly that. So I think I think Ethan deserves some credit in my view for putting together an argument I haven't sort of personally considered at any length. Certainly, I think most people who are no longer affiliated with the LDS Church, but uh, are become Christian, become Protestant, become Catholic, Orthodox, what have you, uh, certainly entertain the possibility as the more you become engrossed in Christian teaching, the less comfortable I think you become with the occult details and occult involvement in the origins of the Book of Mormon. But it's not something I had sort of given a lot of thought to. But from my own vantage, I think Ethan made a really compelling argument, certainly under the terms of the debate. and I would fully agree on that. Like if we're sort of ranking, like, okay, what are all the possibilities that we could have here? There could be God inspired it, just as the LDS Church sort of puts it forward, and that's one option. One that I suppose nobody's covered would be, God inspired it, but it means something different than what the LDS Church teaches. I suppose that's like a mysterious third thing. It could be wholly naturalistic explanations. That's another category. It could be wholly demonic. It could be some admixture of those things in between. And certainly, from my perspective, the God inspired this to happen is at the lowest tier. And I think Ethan made a really, really compelling case, a very interesting argument that gives me a lot to think about.
Sorry, anytime someone says the phrase "compelling argument," you guys watch The Office? Have you seen The Office?
I have seen The Office, yeah.
Okay. There's a scene in there, and I guess Office fans will appreciate this. There's a scene in there where he's talking to Daryl, who is the warehouse guy, and he's like asking for a raise, and he like looks up online. Michael Scott looks up online like negotiation tactics on what to do, and he like sits back in his chair. This is one of the tactics, and he just like lowers his voice and starts like talking really softly. He's like, "You make a really compelling argument." So anytime someone says that phrase "compelling argument," it like makes me think of that scene, and it totally threw me off. But Ethan, was there getting back to the topic? Ethan, was there anything else that you wanted to say about the proposition? So I just asked that question, but let me sort of lay out for the audience what we're going to do tonight. Just so you get an idea of what we're going to cover. So first thing we're going to do very shortly is we're going to lay out Ethan's positive case. Then we're going to start to look at some clips from the debate itself. And in particular, we're going to look at the ways in which Luke actually responded to Ethan's arguments, because if you comb through the debate, which I have, there's not a lot of portions where there is actual engagement with Ethan's arguments. So there's really only a select number that we're going to be able to go through tonight, and we'll see how the evening goes depending on which clips we pull and stuff. But that's basically the overall plan for tonight, is to get Ethan's case, then start to look at Luke's responses, and then dig into some of those details. But Ethan, getting back to my question that I asked you earlier, was there anything else you wanted to say about the proposition?
Well, yeah, I felt the other thing that needed to be clarified based on a lot of the reactions that we were getting to the debate was what it means for the debate to be about the inspiration of the book, right? So the debate was not about, is the content of the Book of Mormon like overtly demonic, right? That wasn't the question in the debate. So we're not saying this is like the, LaVey Satanist Bible, and that there's all these overt indications with the text where it's like the devil has signed his signature to the text saying, hey, it's me, the devil, writing a book, right? No, the question is about inspiration. So inspiration, if you just go check a dictionary, it's what like mentally stimulates somebody to do something. And so that could be that demons were not involved in dictating the book at all, but it was an experience that Joseph Smith had with a demon that inspired him to start the Book of Mormon translation process, and then he naturally dictated everything. It could be that the demons provided him with assistance or insight, right? But then there was also a substantial contribution by him or by his collaborators. All of these are consistent with the debate proposition having been proven. So the question is just, for what inspired Joseph, what led him to produce the book, is the evidence more consistent with that being divine or being demonic? It has nothing to do with literary criticism of the book itself.
Yeah, why are you making this point? Is it because the only thing that was being said from the other side after the debate was that they clipped out the portion where Luke asked you like how much of the Book of Mormon that you've read, and you were just like, oh, I've read like 30% of it, and you were really referencing like the parts that were relevant to the debate thesis. And then they took that and they ran with it and were like, you haven't even read our book. How can you claim that it was inspired by demons? And yeah, maybe we can talk about that a little bit before we get to
read it all.
To your actual arguments.
More than a few times.
Well, yeah. So no, and I think this is a good point to address, because I would say of this like 2.5 hour debate, if they were going to take out a clip of 15 seconds from these 2.5 hours, that is literally the only one where it looks like a rhetorical victory for their side and the opinion of the people who watch the clip. There's literally in 2.5 hours of material, that's it. And I think that goes to show you, if I was really criminally underprepared for the debate, wouldn't that show up in some other point of the debate other than the parts where you're making it specifically about me and not about the debate proposition? So if it turns out that I just don't know all the basic information that I need to affirm the resolution, wouldn't that become obvious in some other part of the debate rather than the parts that are about me? But no, there's no other place where it becomes relevant. And so this gets to the point, which is I read everything that was relevant to the arguments that I wanted to make in the debate. I read commentaries on the Book of Mormon, both from people that are friendly to Mormons and people that are critical of Mormons. If I go through like a bunch of repetitive battle stories in, the vernacular of the King James, it wasn't actually going to help me make any point, and I had limited time to prepare. So instead, what I chose to spend all my time doing was going through Vogel's primary source collection of documents and actually reading through the primary documents and doing my best to reconstruct the history of the composition of the book. And since the question is about the composition and not about me giving an emotional personal testimony about how I felt after, having read like King Mosiah say something, that was what I needed to do.
But Ethan, if you would have read the whole thing, then you would have seen that it mentions Jesus Christ all over the place, and therefore couldn't have been inspired by demons.
And we'll get into it, but I totally anticipated that argument and prepared for it extensively. But I do like an analogy that I gave on Twitter, which is, suppose you find out that like a serial killer like Ted Bundy or Charles Manson has come, and he has like a random string of characters that literally is 2,600 pages long. And then he says at first that he got these characters from a demon, but then later changes his story and says it's from God. And then somebody wants to come and challenge him and say, hey, I don't think that's from God. Then he says, well, in order to be qualified to debate me, you need to sit there and read my 2,600 pages of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, random 1, 8, 4, 3 string of characters in order to be qualified to debate me. No, that's actually not a requirement. So the Indian origins fan fiction that Joseph Smith came up with, which includes substantial sections that are just directly straight copy pasted from the King James Bible, no, you actually don't need to read all 600 pages from cover to cover to make an argument that principally focuses on the historical record surrounding how it was made and the character of the person who's claiming to speak on behalf of God.
Yeah, it seems to me like Luke was maybe expecting you to make a different type of argument from the content of the Book of Mormon to the conclusion that it was inspired by demons. Maybe that's what he was expecting, and then so that's what I'm trying to be as charitable as possible here. Probably what happened there was that he was trying to ask a gotcha question, but maybe that's what he was expecting. But to me, like as an outsider, because I was hosting the debate, but I can still consider myself an outsider in that respect. I wasn't a participant. What's most relevant is the historical context, like you put it, the proximate context. What was going on while it was being written, right? If it was inspired, because that's the whole debate proposition. It is more likely that the Book of Mormon was inspired by demons than by God. So it was about an inspiration. It wasn't about the content necessarily. So Jeremy, feel free to pick up here, but then we're going to turn pretty quickly over to Ethan's actual argument and give you guys a kind of better perspective on how the argument functioned, because there was a lot of material in Ethan's opening, and we're just going to kind of distill it down.
I was only going to add somewhat, ironically, and Ethan sort of mentioned it or alluded to it. If you were to take the portions of the Book of Mormon that are either direct or direct quotations or very close paraphrases of the Bible, of both the Old Testament, principally Isaiah, and portions of the New Testament, I would say Ethan's probably read substantially more than 30% of the Book of Mormon, serially. in that regard. But I agree. I don't think you have to have read the entirety of the book in order to come to that. I also think it's a little bit unfair in the sense that I'm fairly certain that most of the LDS interlocutors have not read some important Catholic work from cover to cover. Like if I were to say, do you think the Catechism is divinely inspired or not? And they say, well, I don't think it is. I said, but you haven't read the entire Catechism. Like, how can you say that? That's obviously just not true. That's not a good argument. I wouldn't require them to read the entire Catechism in order to say is the Catechism from God or not. There are a number of ways that you could arrive at that conclusion that don't require you to read every single word.
Right. I mean, you could read a portion of a work, not to spend too much time on this, but you could read a portion of a work that you think is demonically inspired or whatever, and be like, okay, well, there it is. Like, that's the part. And they're like, well, you haven't read the whole thing. It doesn't matter. Like, I've still pinpointed something here that does seem to have this implication. Now, that wasn't Ethan's argument, so maybe there's a good point to pivot to what Ethan's argument actually was in his opening statement, because Ethan's a very good, like, you guys don't know this. Ethan was it in high school or was it in college, or what's your debate background? Both? Okay. Yeah. So you're actually a seasoned debater, like you've, I think, won awards. Is that right? Doing debate? Yeah. So you're very experienced at this, and you have certain strategies that you develop as you do this kind of thing. But what can happen is that for someone who's maybe not familiar with the type of debate that you do, wasn't it policy debate? So with that type of debate, sometimes, like with your opening statement, you have so much information you want to get across in your opening statement that it seems like you're reading fast, but that's actually just like part and parcel of being a policy debater, from what I understand. So maybe what we can do now is just like, Ethan, what was your like overall argument that you were making in your opening statement?
Yeah. Well, and it's true. I mean, part of it is a habit that I have from doing policy debate, where we talk substantially faster than I talk in any of these opening statements in policy debate. If you go watch it online, it'll be unintelligible to an ordinary person. So like I'm in a bad habit of speaking really quickly, because that's what I did for like 8 years, whenever I was debating. So I'm still learning to basically speak figuring out what the right basically pace is for the average listener who's not doing that activity. But yeah, as for the argument that I made in my speech, well, so first, the overarching framing for the entire speech was, let's apply Joseph Smith's own teachings about demons to Joseph Smith and see whether he passes his own test for, basically whether he's a false prophet or a true prophet. So if we just apply Joseph's own worldview and his own criteria that he develops and teaches to his followers. And I think this is really, really important, because it shows, if I'm successful in showing that he doesn't even meet his own criteria. So it's not just that he doesn't meet the Catholic criteria, it's that he doesn't even meet his own criteria. Then it shows that Mormonism is self-defeating. And they can say, like he tried to say at the end, oh, well, Joseph Smith's not infallible in our worldview. Yeah, but at the very least, he's reliable. And if it's a question of probability, obviously Joseph Smith's opinion, which has been reiterated by all of the Mormon prophets, who are the highest authorities within their church, his opinion is obviously much more probable within Mormonism than Luke's private judgment. And so he's also claiming to actually have supernatural insight directly from God about the laws that govern how demons work. And then he's going and naming specific people and saying, oh, you have a false spirit, and yet you're doing all these things, right? So he's actually claiming it directly as revelation, and he's claiming it as having supernatural powers of discernment, and he's claiming to actually apply it to particular individuals and making practical decisions on that basis. So the idea that Mormons can actually distance themselves from or reject Smith's epistemology for this, it's not true. But once we realize what the implications of his epistemology are, we realize it leads them with no way to actually rebut the debate proposition. Because Smith's worldview entails that if you don't presuppose Mormonism, you're going to conclude that Mormonism is very likely false. So what are the elements of Smith's worldview that lead to that conclusion? Well, basically two elements. First is about the prior probability. So basically, how common are false prophets versus true prophets according to Joseph Smith? And he says that every religion in the world has been deceived by false spirits because they've raised up thousands or tens of thousands of false prophets. And meanwhile, his prophetic tradition includes a much, much smaller number of true divine legates that actually spoke on behalf of God. So we're starting out with a massive prior against anyone that claims to be a false prophet. In fact, for Joseph Smith, the true prophet that was raised up, he's condemning dozens of false prophets like that he's meeting in his own day and age. So he's meeting dozens of them in his own immediate context. So we start out with an extreme prior against Joseph. So we would need special reasons to think that he was from God. So that flips the burden already. Just that assumption alone flips the whole burden in the debate to give us reasons to think that he's different from ordinary. Because the vast majority of people who claim to have revelations from God are actually demonically inspired according to Joseph. So then the second thing is there evidence that distinguishes Joseph Smith from false prophets? And what Joseph Smith taught was, which I quoted in this Times and Seasons article, is that there is literally no way to tell the difference between a true spirit and a false spirit without presupposing the Mormon priesthood and the regular constituted authorities and the powers of discernment that existed in the apostles' day but left the world. So you can't use miracles, you can't use theological content. They say, oh, well, if the book talks about Jesus, it can't be demonic. Well, Joseph Smith spent like 500 words explaining why that was a terrible argument and why the Irvingites talked all about Jesus, but nonetheless were false prophets that were inspired by a false spirit, and giving all these theological rationales for why that argument doesn't work. So he goes through all of it. He goes through moral fruits. He doesn't think that works. Miracles, those don't work. The content, that doesn't work. He says what you need is just to presuppose that he's been given the priesthood and can tell the difference. So if we're not presupposing it, if we're just evaluating it neutrally, he thinks there's no objective way to tell the difference between him and demons. So demons are more likely, and there's no way to tell the difference. So already, he's self-defeated himself. I haven't even talked about any evidence, right? Then once we start to get into specific evidence, we realize his case needs to be 1,000 times better than mine to just overcome the prior. And we've already ruled out all the ways he could make a good case from Joseph's own teaching and shown that he can't reject Joseph's teaching. So it's already a layup. And then it's just going to get devastating when we see how much positive evidence there is for demons. So before I keep going with my case, maybe we let Jeremy jump in.
Yeah, no, I like I said, I think it's an interesting constructed argument, and it is the case in my experience. Joseph Smith comes across a lot of people in his ministry that he who claim revelations and these kinds of things. That he denounces their particular revelation as being wrong, and you have it early. I think you mentioned in the debate, right? You have the Hiram Page fiasco, but you have a number of these throughout early Mormon history, and it does sort of boil down to, right, Joseph Smith's judgment, particularly as his kind of ecclesiology develops over time, where he centralizes authority to make judgments about these things in himself, I think another point that occurred to me is when we're talking about false prophets in the context of Christianity, and the comparison to the Irvingites or the general claim of, hey, but I'm preaching, in the name of Jesus, or what have you. Well, it seems to me that New Testament teaching and warnings about false prophets all presuppose that's of course who we're going that's who we're going to be talking about, right? That these are people who are going to be coming in the name of our Lord and claiming Him, and so that it can't be the case that it's simply professing allegiance of some kind um, to Jesus that tells you that this person is a true prophet or a false prophet.
Well, I just to kind of jump in here, I really liked the start of your opening statement, because what you were doing, to put it in terms that a lot of people will be familiar with, is like you were doing a kind of internal critique at the very beginning, and then you were just kind of going through and giving arguments and evidence that for it being demonically inspired. But I liked that framing, because what you were essentially doing was basically showing that from the LDS perspective, it's way more likely and hard to differentiate between the two. So automatically at the beginning, it's hard. It's more likely demons. And then once you accept that, which is again what Joseph taught, then you go to the second part, which is how do you actually tell the difference between demons and the divine? And you actually can't do that. You just have to basically accept on faith that the Mormon church is the true church. And then from there, like, what do you do? How do you actually give an argument from within the LDS perspective that it was more divine than demonic? And so I like that framing. I do have like a little pushback, which is like maybe that's going to work for an LDS like Luke. But what about convincing the broader audience, like people who are not LDS, people who are not entrenched in that view? Would you just go to discussing the evidence for the history and the context? Would you go there first if you were speaking to like a non-LDS person? What would you do?
Well, no, because basically, an internal critique can work for someone who doesn't accept the worldview, right? So, like, for instance, if you tell somebody about the Islamic dilemma for Muslims, where you say, just given that you accepted Islam, you'd be confronted with a dilemma that would imply neither, regardless of which horn that you chose, that Islam was false, right? So either the Christian scriptures were preserved and they were authoritative, and then they contradicted the Quran, and then Islam is false, or they weren't, in which case the Quran was in error about their preservation and inspiration and authority, in which case the Quran was also false, right? You don't need to accept the Quran to realize that that argument shows you the Quran can't be divine, right? So if I show you that were you to start to lend credence to Mormon authority claims for Joseph Smith, and were you to actually take seriously all these claims about Mormonism that you would have to accept if you became a Mormon, or that would be very probable given that Mormonism was true, that once you did that, you would actually lose any evidence that would lead you to the conclusion that Mormonism was true, because that paradigm is self-defeating. The paradigm, once you internalize those assumptions, shows you that the prior for demons is higher and that all your evidence doesn't rule out demons, so it just defeats itself. That gives you a good reason not to be Mormon and also just accept the prompt. Now, I have a separate worldview where I have criteria for telling the difference between whether it's demons versus whether it's God. But what I can say is the probability that it's God, given that there's a decisive internal critique against Mormonism, is so low that it's going to be trivial to prove that demons are more likely, right? So I think that argument works, regardless of whether the person is Mormon or they're not, because you can appreciate an internal critique, regardless of whether you accept the worldview.
One thing I wanted to add to that is within the LDS framework, and this got brought up in the debate, in the cross examinations, and some other points about the revelation to go to Canada to sell the copyright for the Book of Mormon, and that not panning out. But within the broader LDS culture, that is very dependent on this idea, certainly the ability to sort of proclaim what is God's will, for the church is hierarchically cabined to only certain people, that only within your sort of proper sphere are you able to receive revelation for you can only get revelation for like what is your proper sphere. This is a pretty strong principle within Mormon belief, but that there's this idea, right? Mormon people seek sort of ongoing spiritual prompting and enlightenment all the time, about lots of quotidian things and even big decisions in life, whatever they may be. And I think most LDS people who are being honest about it will acknowledge that even within the LDS culture, there will be acknowledgement of like, hey, well, there's this one time I prayed about a thing and I got an answer and it was wrong. And there is a lot of discussion. You go sit in Sunday school for 20 years or something, and you'll hear these kinds of stories. And Luke's response when he said, it could have been like a learning event, I actually think is very important. It may have been lost on a lot of the audience that in their context, they sort of view this as something of like a spiritual skill that one learns through trial and error, of sort of learning to properly discern the voice of the Holy Spirit when it's prompting you, but when it's not. But what's interesting within this context is that for the instances when it's not, which I think most honest, good faith people within the LDS Church would concede this happens to them. It's happened to people they know. They're kind of left with a few different options for how to reconcile that. One of them is, it was just me. I made a mistake. It was my own thoughts or whatever. But what I think is interesting about Ethan's argument is consistent with the framework that Ethan lays out about how Joseph Smith thinks about this, is that you have to keep in mind that rather than the source of the prompting is not just binary. It's not like my own thoughts and God are the only options. There clearly is another option, which is that it could be nefarious, right? That it could be demonic, a particular prompting that you get. And so it actually does fit very squarely within the kind of lived religious culture of the LDS Church that you might be getting promptings that could or could not be from God, and that they think you sort of learn how to work through these. And so I think Ethan's framing, bringing to light sort of Joseph Smith's framework, puts them in something of a bind, because you end up epistemologically very, very uncertain in like a deeply, deeply subjective realm where you're like, well, how do I know that this prompting I got is from God? If it can be a real problem.
Well, it looks like we've got quite a number of LDS in the chat. I just put up a poll who won the debate, and Ethan, you're at 65%.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, 65%. It's fluctuating because people are still sending in votes. If you're watching this live, then send in your vote now so we can have an objective measure of who actually won.
As objective as the voting pool for
yeah,
for
super objective. Jeremy, I did want to ask you this. I should have asked you earlier, and then we will return to the second half of Ethan's opening statement. Jeremy, who did you think won the debate, and why?
I thought Ethan won the debate, and I know that there obviously a lot of LDS people might look at that and be like, well, clearly he thought he won the debate. He's not Mormon. He's ex-Mormon. And I'd say I'm not above. I watch these things. I don't need to name drop, but I have watched debates that I thought people lost to LDS people or did not perform particularly well. Within the Catholic world, I've watched Catholic people debate things and thought, I don't think they won the debate in terms of the debate. And obviously, I think for all of the audience, all of us included, know that like this debate isn't settling the question of where most people actually land. It may be very useful for people on the margins, and I think it is useful for that. But right, it doesn't. I've watched Catholic people lose a debate, and that doesn't make me think that that Catholicism is wrong, but I think Ethan won the debate, and from my own perspective, I didn't see a lot of substantive answers that were particularly meaningful. And I saw a lot. We'll get into these, but I saw a lot that I think are really really bad responses to what Ethan had to say, and that I don't take particularly serious.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of them he Luke just straight up got checkmated on, and we'll talk
I mean,
about
the
that.
one that you clipped, it's rough. Like, I would think everybody could acknowledge that if it is the case, right? Bracket that. But if it is the case that Joseph Smith sacrificed an animal to appease a demon, um, uh, that
Important context though, during the writing of the Book of
yeah, like
the
in
translation
the
project or whatever.
context of the bringing forth of the Book of Mormon, would this mean he's a false prophet? Uh, something you learn as a lawyer, when you get up and you argue, is you always need to know what kinds of concessions you need to make before a court, because when you refuse to concede anything, you can sometimes look ridiculous. You can look not credible because you just doggedly won't concede anything. But that point, for instance, I mean, like, if the proposition is if he sacrificed an animal to a demon, that's rough. If you can't concede that, yeah, that would be pretty damning evidence. But let me tell you why I don't think that he did, right? But that's not really the response that we got, other than a little bit of very high level of generality, hand waving, to plant doubt in the listeners' minds about the credibility of the primary sources for that particular account.
Since you mentioned that clip, let's just go ahead and play it real quick. This is the very beginning of Ethan's cross-exam of Luke. So whenever you begin with your first question, I will start the first timer. One last reminder. So there's 4 total sections, each 10-minute long. So Ethan, then Luke, Ethan, then Luke. Then we'll move to closing statements and Q&A. There you go. Yep. Ready to go when you are.
Cool. Okay. If Joseph Smith sacrificed a sheep to a demon right before he claimed the revelation of the golden plates from which he translated the Book of Mormon, would that disqualify him as a prophet in your eyes?
I don't know.
So that's the clip that you're talking about, was discrediting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's like very credible. I think we could just say, yeah, like, if someone said to me, if I could prove to you that every person claiming the papacy from Pope Saint Linus on down to the current Holy Father, is currently sacrificing animals to demons, if I could prove that, would that make you think that there was a problem with the Catholic Church? I would say yes, I do. I do think that could be a problem.
Yeah, well, no, it brings up it brings up a substantive point, which is just how are moral qualifications related to the credibility of Joseph Smith's claims, and of basically whether God has chosen to appoint this man to be the person who's going to come promulgate the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price and Doctrine and Covenants and all of these revelations that he's going to bind people to accept and to restore the gospel to the world after great apostasy. What are the moral qualifications for that mission? And basically, it seems like if you're answering this question with I don't know, you're basically saying the moral character of Joseph Smith is completely irrelevant to whether he is a suitable candidate for God to give him such a mission. And I think that's not true. I think that's clearly unbiblical. So first is that not all sins are treated equal with respect to eligibility for a prophetic mission. So there are some sins that prophets can commit, and you can have people who are prophets who become fallen prophets, or prophets who were sinners and committed sins, even sometimes grave sins, before they were elected to be prophets. But there are certain types of sins that are directly opposed to the mission that the person would be claiming for themselves, to where therefore it would just be so imprudent for God to choose to elect that person to be a prophet, especially a foundational prophet. So someone who's claiming to get their authority directly from God rather than from someone who's previously been accredited by God, but they're claiming it directly from God, where the only way people are going to be able to tell is by looking towards this person's credentials, which our Lord specifically tells us the way you're supposed to tell in Matthew 7 is by looking to their fruits, their moral character. So he's telling us it's relevant. And in First Timothy, we're being told, like, one thing that's relevant to whether a person's going to be chosen to be a leader is their moral character, whether they're suitable. And one thing that is definitely opposed to it is if you're going to claim revelations, being a person who not only communicates with evil spirits, but actually worships evil spirits by offering them blood sacrifices. That is literally something that throughout the Bible and throughout the Book of Mormon is specifically associated with being a false prophet. So if God wants it to be recognizable that this person is a true prophet, he's not going to choose a person of all the people he could choose that is specifically associated with the behaviors that lead to someone being a false prophet and being demonically inspired throughout all of our scriptures. At the very least, it's going to so substantially raise the probability that they're demonic that we can basically dismiss them on that basis alone, even if it wasn't a strict disqualification. But it's pretty much a strict disqualification when we actually look. Like, for instance, we're looking in First Chronicles and we're finding out that someone favored by God who has a divinely appointed office, the first king of Israel, was then just killed by God for even going to consult with a medium, not to mention being like one of the most prominent necromancers in the entire state who's engaging in blood sacrifices. But then a secondary criteria that we also should keep in mind is, even if you think he could do the blood sacrifice, at the very least he's going to be like St. Paul and be like, I'm the greatest of all sinners, I'm completely owning up to all my past mistakes. Right? But for the person to not publicly repent, but in fact to lie and to whitewash the conduct that they were guilty of after their supposed calling to be a prophet is also completely incompatible with it. But at the very least, finally, this is my last point. So the first point is the type of sin is opposed to a prophetic calling. The second point is there would need to be repentance rather than deceit. But the third point is, and this one is extremely clear too, at the very least, you're all out of the prophets can make mistake card. Okay, you can't play that card anymore. So if it turns out that he's doing equally serious sins later in his life that are making him look disreputable and like a bad guy, God is not going to give us a fruits test and then say, oh yeah, the unrepentant demon worshiper who later became like an adulterer and financial fraudster who everyone around him is getting demon possessed. Yeah, that's the guy that I'm going to put in charge of promulgating this revelation that everyone's supposed to believe. No, it just means he's ineligible to be a prophet. And so therefore the only option that remains of the two on the table is that he's demonically inspired, which it makes sense because he's doing the activity that in scripture is associated with getting demonic revelations.
Yeah. I saw this comment pop up in the chat, and I just wanted to put it up here. He should have said that he rejects the premise of the question. It's a loaded questions fallacy. So what were you asking a loaded question? What was it, a loaded questions fallacy? I mean, what, maybe you can just explain why you were asking a conditional question.
Yeah, well, so we're getting to a point. So we're asking a hypothetical conditional, which is not always loaded, right? We're having a whole debate about whether these accounts are credible or whether they're not credible, which is something that we're going to get into, which is I think this testimony is very credible, and I think he completely failed to impeach the testimony. And the response I've seen from Mormons has been very bad to actually dealing with this testimony rather than just summarily dismissing it. But it's not a loaded question to ask someone about a point of principle, right? So what I'm asking him is, if I were to prove my point, do you concede that that then would carry the burden for the proposition, right? Do you concede that if I am right that this did in fact occur, that satisfies my burden for the debate? And so that's entirely a relevant question that's worth entertaining, which is we need to understand that we agree upon the stakes and then we can argue about the facts. But we need to agree about the implications and then we can talk about the facts.
Yeah, there's nothing fallacious about the question. It's not, have you stopped beating your wife, right? It's not that kind of question. It is, if this thing were true, would you concede this particular conclusion? I do think, as Ryan K. 1012 says, he could have said, I'll answer your question but then I just want to say, and maybe he does, and after the clip, I don't know, maybe he comes back and says, I'm going to fully dispute the premise that he ever
Well,
engaged.
he
in
does
such
that. He does that. He, in my view, fails at responding to Ethan's follow-up line of questioning, which I was planning on getting into. We'll get into it a little bit later, but
one other just quick point that's odd about this, it kind of seems like a little bit maybe Luke's answer. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that he does accept that this would be disqualifying because, methinks she doth protest too much. That if you think about it a little bit like Joseph Smith's polygamy, that often people are like, well, will go to great lengths to argue that Joseph didn't consummate any of his marriages with his plural wives, and you have to sort of ask why. There's no dispute that his immediate followers, or Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and all the members of the Quorum of the 12, after this point, they definitely consummated their marriages and had children with their many wives. And you're supposedly defending the principle that polygamy was divinely inspired and a commandment of God. Like, if it's the case that certainly there are some LDS apologists and others who take a view that accept the veracity of a lot of these claims and say, hey, I think like it's a pretty standard argument to say, yeah, like Joseph was engaged in this treasure seeking, but God like used it as a tool to reveal his actual prophetic gifts to him, and he slowly gravitates away from this. Well, why would it be disqualifying then if one of those things was animal sacrifice, that he then later learns like, hey, I shouldn't do that? Why such consternation about that particular fact? And why such consternation about a lot of the particular facts of the occult that he was engaged in? Like, why choose some features of the occult to say, well, I think these ones I have to concede he did, and I think it's okay because it was the folk magic context of New England, and everybody believed this, and out of that culture he sort of learns his prophetic gift. But why is it limited to just those ones? Like, why are you fighting so hard with respect to a lot of others? Why not just accept them? But I think it's a little bit telling that they don't want to accept them because something inside of them tells them, yeah, it does seem a little problematic.
Yeah, I mean that was the reason why he immediately turned. If we kept watching the clip, that's immediately why he turned to trying to discredit the Stafford testimony.
Yeah, and it may just be nice to talk about it now since it's just directly relevant.
Well, I did want to give you a chance to lay out like the second half of your opening statement. So we can choose to either focus on Stafford now.
It's actually relevant. So it comes up next in my opening statement, which is basically there's basically three phases of argument to the next part of my opening statement. So one of them is going to be these like moral qualifications argument about basically like committing grave sins that are specifically associated with false prophecy and demons in the Bible and in the Book of Mormon, being unrepentant about them being completely habitual, them coinciding exactly with the period when he's supposedly receiving the prophetic calling, lying about them later, and then we're completely removing any further excuses for misconduct later in his life that repeats this pattern. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is, okay, here's basically evidence that he didn't even claim a prophetic calling or to have received the golden plates from an angel until the late 1820s, right? So it's only in 1828 or so that this story is actually going to get invented, that he had ever spoken to an angel of the Lord. And so I go through in detail and I make a historical case that actually the version of the story that had been told to the Palmyra residents and the Manchester residents, the things that people had actually heard about concerning Smith and how he obtained the plates, was actually involving a treasure guardian. So a lot of the money digging experiences where Smith is using a seer stone to go hunt for buried treasure, a big part of the money digging lore was that the treasure would be protected by evil spirits and the spirits of like deceased people that had been murdered. So like murdered Native Americans or like Captain Kidd the pirate. Like the most common treasure guardian was literally Satan himself, is one of the ones that's the most common treasure guardians who protects these treasures, right? And so it was very common for people to come, and these stories had a very particular structure to them, a narrative structure. And I show in my opening statement how even Smith's own later telling in his official histories in 1838 doesn't match the stories in the Bible of prophetic callings that all are receiving revelation, but matches perfectly all the money-digging stories that he was completely immersed in within his local context. And what we can show is that the most credible testimony we have that we can independently corroborate is tracing back the actual original story about how he obtained the golden plates to a treasure guardian. And that within the original story, there are overt indications within the story that the treasure guardian was an evil spirit rather than an angel of the Lord. And all the religious content is getting embellished later on. And so he completely reimagines it to sanitize it of the folk magic elements and to keep adding more and more religious elements over time. Now notice, if I prove this second point, that just settles the debate. Because if Joseph didn't even claim to receive the golden plates from God, but his original claim was he received them from an evil spirit, not only is it just common sense that it couldn't be from God then, but we should just go based off of the earliest, most credible testimony from Joseph, where he's claiming to have received the golden plates from God. And the golden plates on Joseph's telling are the source text for the Book of Mormon. So that would just prove the resolution directly if the earliest version of Joseph's story is that he received the plates from an evil spirit rather than an angel of the Lord. And so then we can get into that evidence later if you want. But I go and show, basically, we need to distinguish between two things, right? The two things that need to be distinguished between are when the date is for the testimony that we have from somebody about the story they heard from Joseph, and then when that person claims that they heard the story from Joseph. And so this Willard Chase testimony has the best combination of both of those features. So he's claiming to have heard the story from Joseph Sr. in 1827, and his testimony, his sworn testimony, which is sworn to in front of a justice of the peace in Willard Chase's case, is being written down in 1833, which is exactly coincident with Joseph Smith's first official history. So already it has the best combination of when he's claiming to have heard the story and when the testimony is actually recorded and taken down. And so then we see that it's corroborated in a million ways. So there's a bunch of undesigned coincidences between it and other accounts from people about stories that they heard from the Smith family. Now, the Smith family, as a bunch of people pointed out, were constantly contradicting themselves and telling the story in different ways to different people, depending on who they were talking to. But we can see that there are motifs that keep recurring that show that even between accounts that should be independent of each other, there's no way they're going to fabricate exactly the same details as each other, and yet the same details are showing up in their accounts of what the Smith family was saying, which is showing us that these aren't just fabrications by the hostile sources, but seem to trace back to an actual historical memory of what the Smith family was claiming at first about this treasure guardian encounter. Then the second thing, and then I'll move on to the final phase of the opening, we can return to all this later, but the second thing that's really important to worth pointing out is that people often don't notice. Joseph Smith doesn't tell his story, his canonical story, in print. He doesn't publish his history for people to scrutinize until 1832 when he's moved away to Kirtland, Ohio. Meanwhile, 1831, the year before, the Palmyra Reflector is writing to its local newspaper readership, which is all the people who have heard from the Smith family, and saying, hey, everybody knows that he never mentioned angels until long after the pretended finding of this book. So the earliest account we can find from anybody that claims it's angels is Smith family private letters from 1828, when we know Smith had already made up the angel story. But what's interesting is in those Smith family private letters, this version of the story is that he was told that he had received divine knowledge and divine revelation from an angel of the Lord who's not named Moroni, but he had received that so that he could have dominion over all the lands of Palmyra and tons of money. So you can see that his money-digging ambitions that he's sort of being grandiose and bragging about to his family are coming through even in the earliest version that mentions angels. But meanwhile, the way more credible testimony for what they were saying in 1827 all the way back to 1823 is that it started out as a toad transforming to the spirit of a deceased prophet, evil spirit, treasure guardian. So then finally, the final phase of my opening was just to go and say, okay, now after the Book of Mormon was released, the way we're supposed to judge fruits is insofar as those fruits reflect on the character of the prophet, so the person who's claiming something to be a divine revelation, and not insofar as a tree produces fruit, which produces a tree, which produces fruit, which produces a tree, which produces fruit. That's not how you judge somebody's fruits. You can't tell that the founder of Yale was a good guy based off of what Yale does 300 years later. You look at the immediate context, what happened. And so, based on Joseph's own telling about what happened in the immediate context, when the gospel, the restored gospel, comes and gets brought to Kirtland, immediately there's a huge outbreak of evil spirits among the early Mormons. And there's all these manifestations of false spirits that are leading them to ridiculous and almost suicidal behavior in Kirtland. So then, when he comes to town to try to institute the authorities to rein this in, what happens? And we have this from Mormon friendly sources. What happens is, at his general conference in 1831, he's ordaining somebody a high priest. He lays his hands on the high priest to ordain him, and then the guy is instantly demon possessed. He starts convulsing. He's like bound and can't move. He's making all these body contortions. His face is becoming contorted. And then somebody has to come over. Joseph's brother has to come over and shame Joseph into being like, Joseph, this isn't of God. And Joseph's like, don't speak against this. And he's like, Joseph, really, I'm not going to believe in you anymore if you don't inquire of God, and he owns this. And so Joseph reluctantly goes and he tries to cast out the demon. But then what happens? The demon then, according to even the Mormon-friendly accounts, takes turn possessing every member of Mormon leadership, basically, that's in the room for the rest of the night. Okay, so that's what the demon is doing. Now, recall, Joseph Smith had claimed like apostles after Pentecost level powers for himself before this event occurred. So he was claiming to basically have like complete and total authority over demons and to perform all miracles and stuff like this. We have credible accounts of him making like audacious claims like that for himself and for Oliver Cowdery. And so it's totally ridiculous to think that this obviously discrediting event is going to occur, and he's going to be completely hapless and even reluctant to manage the demon outbreak that's happening as he's trying to manage the demon pandemic that's come with the spread of Mormonism. But then we see that this pattern literally continues throughout the entire rest of the time. So Sidney Rigdon, the number 2 guy for most of Mormon history, he becomes possessed by a demon, tells everybody that, God has withdrawn himself from the church, that it's worthless to pray or do anything. So Joseph comes and rebukes him, and then the devil has this extraordinary encounter with him later that night. Okay, this is according to Joseph Smith's mom that you're getting the story about Sidney Rigdon, number 2 in command, who then gets reinstated. And this is like the worst discernment ever on Joseph's part, because he goes on to continue being mentally unstable and becoming more and more distant from Joseph after he's reinstated, even though Joseph is giving the pretext that he's like St. Peter repenting after denying Christ, even though, remember, all of this is really supposed to be after Pentecost. And both Rigdon made the claims, similarly audacious claims as Smith, about himself and his own prerogatives. And then we go through, and throughout the remainder of the opening, I just show, demon possession for one of the key Book of Mormon witnesses, Martin Harris. There's literally this charm page, one of the Book of Mormon witnesses incident, where he goes and has false revelations that are from the devil, according to Smith. And then Oliver Cowdery, who earlier Doctrine and Covenants canonized scripture revelations for Mormons, say that he has revelatory superpowers. Joseph basically has to walk that back and say that actually Joseph is the only one that can receive the revelation, and that Oliver Cowdery was just deceived by the devil along with the entire Whitmer family. And even, which is the icing on the cake, which Deuteronomy 18 says that just uttering one false prophecy in the name of the Lord disqualifies somebody as a prophet. Well, it turns out Joseph Smith himself uttered a false prophecy that he himself admitted was from the devil rather than from God, when he gave everybody a prophecy saying, hey, I want this group of guys to go to Canada, to Kingston, to try to sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon in Canada. And so they go to Kingston and they find out, oh yeah, there's no copyright office here. You have to go to Toronto instead, even though God is supposedly telling them to go to Kingston. But later historical research shows they couldn't have got it in Toronto either. But the guys come home and they ask Joseph and they're like, hey, what's up? Like, why was this a disaster? It seems like the entire premise of the revelation was wrong. Joseph then says, I'm receiving a new revelation. Some revelations are from God, some are from the devil. So it's literally him admitting that he's deceived by demons about false revelations and then promulgating them too. So we're seeing it's crazy. He's worshiping demons. He's getting the golden plates from demons. He's using the same technology that he used to worship demons to then translate the entire Book of Mormon. And then he's causing a demon pandemic. And then all his leadership is getting possessed and deceived by demons. And he's getting possessed and deceived by demons.
Oh, you're on mute, Cameron.
Oh, sorry. I was saying I want to pull Jeremy in now. So you're pretty familiar with the history of Mormonism and stuff. Like, what is your take on all this? Do you think all of this checks out? Do you have some questions or maybe some pushbacks?
I mean, I think it all. I'm trying to think if there's any particular, um, like that I would push back on. But insofar as these relate how these people experience these things, I mean, I don't think any of those are false. I'm trying to rack my memory here to think if I think
Yeah,
some
I'm
of them
trying to
maybe
like.
made it something,
I'm
but
trying to get you to be, to steel man the LDS position here, and be like, well,
well, I think it would be more rhetorical, which is what I take, or I take Luke's responses to sort of be. It's certainly the case that in the early years of Mormonism, as it's developing, like, D. Michael Quinn has a really great book on this in the Origins of Authority, the Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Authority. In the earliest days, like, there isn't as strict of a hierarchical structure. In fact, that takes quite a long time. It's not even totally settled by the time Joseph Smith is killed in 1844. Um, it is this idea that these gifts are being poured out with the restoration back on the saints, right? And so it's really common for everybody to be sort of doing this. It's also very common. One of the principal charges that a lot of Joseph Smith's close collaborators level against him, as a lot of them leave, some of them later come back, right, is that he's a fallen prophet. Like, this is pretty standard rhetoric against Joseph Smith by people in his close circles. I think Oliver Cowdery calls him a false prophet at once. Martin Harris calls him a false prophet, right? They maintain belief um, in sort of a different idea, which goes to show a little bit of how retroactively, kind of anachronistically, LDS people tend to view the early years of Mormonism. Like, it's like the way people thought about authority and structure worked the same way. It just didn't. And it's why, Martin Harris could go off and follow somebody else that said they found some other plates and received a revelation, yet never deny that he believed in the Book of Mormon. But I think in the main, as far as I can remember, those are accurate accounts. I mean, did Luke contest that? I know he contested that was evidence of demonic influence on the part of Joseph Smith, that those things happened. Right. Supposedly when Joseph Smith prayed in the Sacred Grove in 1820, he's attacked by the devil, and it's him, trying to stop him. So I suppose part of the case would
And
be,
that's the first supernatural being he ever meets, actually, according to his account. The first
yeah,
supernatural being he meets is Satan.
and that these are right. I think their argument is going to be, well, it's because the restoration of the gospel is so important, that all the forces of hell are essentially aligned against the church, to try to be disruptive, and eventually everybody is exorcised in the Kirtland situation that Ethan's referring to.
yeah, amazing stuff. Let's get to some clips. Let's pull up the first clip, which is I want to get to Stafford. My dog wants some pets. Let's get to Stafford, which is what we're going to turn to now is Luke's response to the Stafford testimony about the sheep being sacrificed. And what was interesting to me was that he reserved part of his opening statement for a rebuttal, which is an interesting strategy because this was supposed to be an opening statement. 2350. Let's turn to 2350 and see if that gives us the right timestamp. All right, let's see.
I'm going to do in the debate tonight. Also, speaking about his comment about the majority of people disagreeing with Joseph Smith, the majority of the testimonies being bad press. Of course, he just ignores the entire church. Anybody in the church automatically discredited, can't be trusted for the most part, unless it sounds demonic, then that's 100% true and was demons. But of course, the majority is going to be negative towards Joseph Smith. Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, as Ethan said, went out and specifically solicited the bad press for Joseph Smith. In fact, we have records of people saying, yeah, he came to me and got testimony from me, but then he ended up not using it because it wasn't good enough. So for Ethan to use this, the majority were negative, the majority were negative, Philastus Hurlbut was paid. He was paid to go out and get these negative testimonies, which disagree with each other, by the way. The Staffords, one of the people that he really emphasized really hard, and that sheep story. There's a little bit of disagreement on the sheep story, by the way. There's somebody said the sheep was stolen, then the son said, actually, I don't recall the sheep ever being stolen, but then it was actually given to him. So that's the story that Ethan's gone with, so he can get that criterion of embarrassment in there and make the story look 100% plausible. The Staffords, something else that they said was that the Smiths were lazy. This was the common theme through all the Philastus Hurlbut affidavits. The Smiths, they're lazy, they're indolent, they don't do anything, they gamble, they drink. All they try to do is get treasure money so that they don't have to work again in their lives. Well, it turns out that the Smiths, in a few short years, went from a farm that was basically nothing to a farm valued higher than 9/10 of the people who testified against them, who unanimously said the Smiths were lazy. Their farm was valued 50% higher on land size. Over 50%, so top half on land size and value per acre of land, putting them somewhere up in the top 80%. The Staffords specifically, the Joseph Smith family farm was valued higher than all of them, all of the family members that testified. But of course, we need to believe their testimony because it corroborates.
Can I respond to this first? Just a few points.
Yeah.
I thought a lot about this, and hear what Ethan has to say. There's a few points here that I think are worth mentioning. I don't think I don't want to put words in Luke's mouth, but I don't know of anybody who seriously, whatever the nominal or face value of the Smiths farm was, I don't know what that was. I don't think anybody denies that the Smith family was essentially that they were subsistence farmers, that they were in severe, dire financial straits through most of their time until Joseph Smith is really able to be set up later in life. I think Richard von Wagner's account says, they're subsistence farmers, meaning their farm is not making money for them in any substantial way. Their farm is getting them along. So I don't know if he's meaning to imply that there's some kind of jealousy on the part of the affiants of the Halbert affidavits that the Smith's farm is worth a lot. I think, Dan Vogel points this out in the notes to his Early Mormon Documents series, which just presents primary sources and then has a few editorial notes. But, it's often the case. A lot of the affiants and the Hurlbut affidavits say that the Smiths are lazy or indolent. That there's a pretty good argument that this is a stand-in for the degree to which the Smiths engaged in treasure digging. It wasn't just a little kind of sideshow thing they did now and again. It's a very substantial part of their life for the better course of at least 7 years. And that there was a general reputation that this is sort of what you do if you're shiftless and lazy. I think really interestingly, Lucy Mack Smith calls this kind of magical aspect of their life, this occult aspect of their life. In her 1845, the initial draft of her family history that she gives, she affirms how important this was to them. She calls it important. She uses that word, but just says, we never allowed it to get out of whack. But, the importance of us I mean, I even think she uses the word soothsaying of all things. Lucy Mack Smith is obviously a friendly source, but in 1845, she still adamantly affirms this point. As far as I can tell, from Joseph Smith's kind of main kind of big ticket biographers, I don't know that any of them seriously doubt the main thrust of the Hurlbut affidavits. Michael Quinn, Fawn Brody, Dan Vogel, Richard von Wagner, Richard Bushman relies on them. What's the guy everybody was talking about, the latest Joseph Smith biographer? John Turner, right? He relies on them on the Hurlbut affidavits.
He repeats the Stafford story as fact in this biography that we're being pointed to. He basically accepts the veracity of the story.
And there's this quote, if I can read it really quick, from D. Michael Quinn's book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, which is a really great book from the 1980s. He says, Mormons traditionally have rejected outright the nearly contemporary accounts from hostile non-Mormons in favor of LDS accounts written long after the event. For example, Mormons readily accept the accuracy of Joseph Smith's sermons, which were massively reconstructed more than a decade after he spoke. In one instance, the Official History of the Church published a 128-word section of his sermon, 12 years earlier. This was someone else's expansion of 5 words in the original manuscript report of Smith's sermon. Apologists extend the broadest possible latitude to sources they agree with, yet impose the most stringent demands on sources of information the apologists dislike. Both scholars and casual readers should give great attention to the reports by Palmyra neighbors of statements and actions the neighbors witnessed. The hostility of contemporary reports and reminiscent accounts is not an adequate basis for assuming distortion in documents of the Mormon past. Likewise, the devotion of LDS reminiscences decades after the events they describe is not grounds for skepticism. Eyewitness reports from hostile Palmyra neighbors and Mormon devotional reminiscences must be evaluated in terms of the evidence. Like I said, I mean, everybody from Dan Vogel on one end of that spectrum to Richard Bushman, I just don't know of any serious historian who doesn't think that in the main the Hurlbut affidavits are substantially accurate. Bushman's take is like, Willard Chase's affidavit gives away the fact that he participates in this stuff. It's normal for people to participate in this stuff, right? Willard Chase seems to be particularly perturbed that Joseph Smith stole his rock from him and didn't give it back. And, that it's a little bit maddening, the inability or unwillingness to look at these sources from a realistic perspective, to say it doesn't mean that everything in the affidavits is accurate. That's not what anybody's saying, but that treasure digging and what pejoratively we could call the occult, or euphemistically folk magic, whatever you want to call it, is a substantial part of the way the Smith family lives. I just don't think anybody contests that, or that they were very much engaged in these treasure quests, or that these treasure quests, as Ethan pointed out, had a very established kind of pattern for how people engaged in them, that involved seers and incantations and rituals to try to bind the evil spirit and these kinds of things. This is like exceptionally well documented that this happened, and so it was a little bit strange for me to see such resistance. I mean, I get it, in particular with respect to the Stafford declaration, and it's also just not the case. This will be my last point. Like, what does it matter that Hurlbut was paid to go get them, or that he sought out people who were negative? He did find people whose affidavits or statements he didn't use that were presumably more positive about the Smiths. But nobody's claiming that the affiants were paid to do that. They may have been mistaken, etc. But like, it just doesn't make any sense to me that we would dismiss them solely on the fact that Hurlbut initially goes out and It gets them. And I mean, there are even ones, Hurlbut goes out, initially he claims he has a letter from Isaac Hale, from Emma Smith's father, saying a bunch of things. And a bunch of people, a bunch of the Mormons at the time saying, no, Isaac Hale is like blind and he can't even write his name, and like this is a total fabrication. So E.B. Howe writes Isaac Hale, who's taken over these documents from Hurl, but he writes Isaac Hale and he's like, hey, this is what they're saying. Do you want to confirm what you said? And Isaac Hale, writes a letter confirming back his statements. It's just not credible to say, oh, these are all, hateful or whatever. Least of all because the LDS community now openly concedes that there was at least some modicum of treasure digging using these, quasi occult practices. Sorry, that was very long.
No. And so I want to, and that a lot of that was great. I think basically first, let's just give everybody context. So Hurlbut is like a disgruntled ex-Mormon.
Yeah.
Nobody's contesting that. And so he was excommunicated in absentia. And so what he decides to do is go and interview everybody that knew Joseph Smith and the Smith family in like Palmyra and Manchester, these places where the Smiths had lived, right? And there's themes that he wants to touch on. And so he's getting testimony that's relevant to that. And so he wants to get information about them being involved in the occult, information about their integrity and their like moral character and their moral uprightness. And he wants to get information about basically the stories that they told about the Golden Bible. And so how the Golden Bible was found. And so those are the big emphases of these Hurlbut affidavits. But there really can't be any credible claim that Hurlbut is responsible for the contents of the affidavits to such an extreme extent that it just can't be attributed to the witnesses themselves, but it's just Hurlbut's animus. So it can't be said. The reason why is, so let's just take Stafford, because that's the case we're focusing on right now. He's going in front of a judge, and we have a statement from the judge certifying that he swore to the statement as written and reproduced in basically Mormonism Unveiled. He swore to it in front of the judge under penalty of perjury, right? So then he's going, and we know in Stafford's case, he's repeating the story to other people after Hurlbut solicited it from him. We can document that. And none of the Hurlbut witnesses are ever challenging these statements that are being attributed to them, but are reaffirming them. And so then the only way Hurlbut's bias can be relevant is he says that there are sometimes Hurlbut doesn't use testimony if it goes against his narrative. All that could be relevant to can't be to the specific incidents. Like, for instance, the Stafford sheep sacrifice. All you could possibly raise questions about on the basis of that is was the overall sentiment of the community negative towards Smith? So was he giving us an unrepresentative sample of these were just the people who were weirdly annoyed with the Smith family? And we know that's not true because we have multiple follow-up investigations that happen that arrive at the same conclusion, that the neighbors had an overwhelmingly negative sentiment, including by pro-Mormon sources. So Mormon missionaries who were reporting that there was a very negative sentiment towards Smith in Palmyra among the residents of Palmyra. So we know that it's not just that Hurlbut, through selection effects, there's certainly a certain level of selection effect because he wants to get the most incendiary testimony. Nobody's denying that, right?
Yeah.
But it clearly is a genuine sentiment. And this is conceded, as we've said, by all the actual credible historians on both the LDS side and the non-LDS side. All of them are conceding that, one, these are preserving real historical memory, even if they're not infallible. They're among the most historically valuable sources about the Palmyra period of Smith's life that we have, and that they're not just complete wholesale fabrications by Hurlbut. So it's sort of irrelevant to focus on that. So then let's just talk about the Stafford testimony specifically. So let's already think about this. This is early sworn testimony under penalty of perjury by Stafford, where he is going and implicating himself in an animal sacrifice of a demon to get buried treasure. If you were just making this up, obviously the easiest thing to say is, oh, Smith stole my sheep and then sacrificed it to a demon. That makes Smith look worse, and it doesn't raise any questions about you, right? So if you're making it up, you'll say that. But he actually goes so far as to mention the detail that he has a fourfold financial interest if the sheep sacrifice is successful, which is an indication that he's passing the criterion of embarrassment. Now, so it's showing us that this really did occur, and there are other people who are saying, "Oh yeah, that's the hill where the Stafford sheep was sacrificed." We have those statements too. So then, the only thing that he brings up is he's implying that there's a discrepancy within the Hurlbut affidavits about the story, but that's not true. That's not true at all. Stafford's testimony regarding this incident, there's no contradiction within the Hurlbut affidavits concerning this at all. There's no discrepancies. There's no testimony from his son in the Hurlbut affidavits. The testimony from the son is 50 years later. The son is not claiming to be a witness. He's saying, I think it probably didn't happen, but here's the kicker. It's Kelly, these LDS apostles, or these like RLDS apostles, come. They don't actually take depositions. They don't show the statements to anybody. They go publish the statements in their newspaper. Then tons of the people who they're publishing statements to are literally writing and protesting and saying, hey, we didn't say what the Kellys are saying that we said. And then later historians have come back. Anderson has done this in basically revisiting the New York reputation of Smith. He comes back and he shows, we have the interview notes from the Kellys, from the interviews that they took down, and they don't match the statements that the Kellys are writing and publishing and attributing to the people. So notice this. This is 50-year late testimony from a non-witness that we're only receiving in an interview where it's an extremely biased party who we know demonstrably it's a verifiable historical fact that they literally just fabricated testimony from the people that they spoke to be favorable to Joseph Smith. And it contradicts literally all the other data, including the first-hand criterion of embarrassment sworn testimony from a direct participant in the event, which is the Stafford testimony. And it's independently corroborated by things like Purple's recollections of the trial, where we're hearing animal sacrifices are occurring in other contexts too. So this isn't just a one-off incident. And from the fact that we know from lots of witnesses that Smith was basically imitating this guy named Lumen Walters, who's like a traveling necromancer. Okay, and he's adopting like even like sort of the persona and a lot of the techniques. And we know that Lumen Walters, for instance, sacrificed roosters to evil spirits to tame them so that he could get access to buried treasure. So it actually makes perfect sense in context too that Smith had adopted this practice because it's part of that folk magic culture. So actually, by historical standards, we have unusually good evidence that this was a historical event that did occur with the blood sacrifice of the sheep that Stafford reports.
I wanted to say, just give an overall picture of like how bad this is. And I think Luke saw that, and that's why he said, I don't know to that question when you asked him. If this is a historical event in the context of the timing of the translation of the Book of Mormon, it's just, to me, it's just QED. It's game over. If he was sacrificing sheep to demons during this period. Is it not good? Like, what am I missing?
If I maybe I'll do some pushback. And Ethan might know this. I haven't brushed up on all of these details. You know, I think in Vogel's making of Joseph Smith making of a prophet, I think Vogel takes the sacrifice as representing a real historical event. I mean, he notes that
he reports it as fact. Yeah.
There are other, if I remember, Vogel's point is that this story does get garbled over time. It switches back of whether it's a dog or it's a sheep. Is it a black dog or a black sheep? Is it a white dog or a white sheep?
That's kind of separate from the Stafford incident. So the Stafford sheep story is different. There's a separate question about the 1826 trial about whether there was testimony concerning the black dog sacrifice. Yeah.
Right.
Lot of animal sacrifice going on.
It's easy to get mixed up with how much of it was going on. Yeah.
I don't know if von Wagner, I don't recall him endorsing this, particular account. I do think von Brody mentions it. But I don't think it's, as Ethan has laid out, like, I don't think it's, unreasonable to take this as, a historically real event that occurred. And it isn't particularly useful that the sort of counterpiece of evidence is so much later from somebody who says, well, my dad didn't really talk about this. I think I would have heard him talk about this if this had happened. And one other point that I think, I kind of alluded to this, and then Ethan made this, is a lot of the people who are mentioned, a lot of the kind of big names, and you see this in the evidence in the 1826 trial in Bainbridge, right, is that a lot of these things satisfy that criterion of embarrassment because, like the reported testimony of the trial is a little bit weird because it's not clear we have an actual transcript. We have two kind of different accounts of what happens. But from what is there, you have people testifying like in Joseph's favor that no, he really does have these powers, right? The trial is under a New York statute that makes these kinds of activities illegal. And it seems like the presupposition of the court is that this is, of course, just fraudulent. But you have a number of people who, I think Dan Vogel has said, Josiah Stoll, like forever believed that, in all this treasure stuff. They absolutely affirmed it.
Yeah, Jonathan Thompson, Josiah Stoll, all of them testify in his defense that it's real magic, right?
Yeah,
and
like
Smith
he really
testifies that it's Smith testifies it's real magic. He says that he's done it for the past 3 years, but he's quitting now because it's starting to hurt his eyes. So like the implication being that like the seer stone lights up so bright and he has to stick his head into the darkness vision.
The squinting is uncomfortable, but again, I don't think that the like the core kind of historical account, the degree to which Joseph Smith Sr., Alvin, and Joseph Smith Jr., Alvin's his older brother, those three in particular are exceptionally engaged. I think most, if not all, I think all of the major biographies of Joseph Smith accept that fact, and they quote freely from, as Ethan pointed out, when he's, I think it's a lot of people accept the framing. I wanted to mention this of the overall change in the narrative, and this was my own conclusion when I left Mormonism, is that the earliest accounts that are reported of this don't have anything to do with like a religious movement. That's not what's going on, and that's a pretty well accepted explanation. A lot of history boils down to we have a bunch of evidence and we need to come up with the theory that has the most explanatory power for all that evidence. But the evidence is pretty strong that the Hill Cumorah incident, in my view, is just one of many. Initially, it's just one of many of these treasure quests in which a number of these characters have financial interests, in which the Smith family is involved. But this particular one, for reasons we don't necessarily have to get into, around 1827 starts to change its character and starts to shift over from, hey, it's not this treasure guardian spirit stuff actually, and this is a prophet and this is a religious book that I have found and God is calling me to something. Those are really kind of well accepted theories among even among people who are believing LDS members, who like Bushman and Quinn. Quinn was excommunicated, but Quinn died believing in the fundamental claims of the LDS Church. That, right, this was the kind of the catalyst, not to launch us into a whole other issue, but the catalyst for the discovery of Joseph's prophetic gift and mission that evolved over time, and which he repents of in some sense, although I don't think the evidence is good that he really does repent of these kinds of practices or beliefs. They stick with him through the rest of his life.
Yeah, it is remarkable that in light of the historical evidence that this religion is even a thing today, to be honest. maybe you guys would disagree with that. But let's get to some super chats. I should have mentioned this earlier that we will be taking super chats this evening. So if you'd like to send one in and have us address a question or a comment, then we'd be happy to. So this one from Distracting Games. I don't think either of you won the debate, but I do understand where you're coming from. I think a better argument to prove Mormonism false is to show the Trinity in the Book of Mormon.
I disagree. I don't think the Trinity, properly speaking, is in the Book of Mormon. I'll interested in what Ethan thinks, but I know this came up, but I think the original 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon and the broader evolution of the LDS theological cosmology, which has several pretty distinct phases between the early, the late 1820s and then up through the 1830s, the 1840s, and then even into the Brigham Young period and into the early 20th century. The conception of the nature of God changes dramatically through distinct phases in that part. And in my view, the original 1830 Book of Mormon is pretty on the nose modalist, that it teaches numerical identity between the Father and the Son. And the book seems pretty self-consciously aware of the fact that it is resolving this controversy by declaring that Jesus is the very eternal Father, which it repeats a bunch of times throughout the book. And in the Book of Ether, there's also this. I talk about some of this in my memoir about I think, a really strong case for modalism in there, which is also false. So I'd qualify that last statement. I would say it's false because it teaches false Christology, but I don't know what you think, Ethan.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think there's a time for every debate to be had. So, like, I don't think, I mean, everybody has their pet argument that they think is the most compelling to them, given the way that they think. And different people are going to be responsive to different arguments to different degrees, And so, I mean, a lot of times in my experience, I've found Mormons to be very, like, basically they almost feel like their sort of anti-Trinitarian theology is like a strong point for them, and they tend to be pretty unfazed by discussions of the Trinitarian theology with them. Now, like, I think it is an interesting debate that should be had with them. I don't know if this was the debate for it, though, given the prompt. And I think the historical evidence is so damning too that it's a good argument to make. But basically, there is an argument to be made that their later theology just so clearly is not the theology of the Book of Mormon. So, like, if you just held Mormons to the Book of Mormon, they're clearly departing from it, because where we started out was basically just like a mildly heretical Protestant, and so we're dealing with somebody. He has a Trinitarian heresy, which is a big deal, which is modalism, right? And it's very explicit in various places, like in Alma 11, all these places where we're just addressing the question, where we're saying the Son is the Father, right? We're collapsing the personal distinction between the Son and the Father. And so it's just irony of ironies. The first error that Joseph Smith endorses in the first 1830 version is collapsing the personal distinctions. And then by the end of his life, and then through later developments in Mormonism, now they're in the era of like tritheism, where they've completely reified the personal distinction.
I think for what it's worth, and then we can move on to another chat or something. But I agree. The doctrine of the Trinity is very complex, and I'm not a theologian, and it is complex. But I think the better argument begins with this issue in the Book of Mormon, that it originally in 1830 taught a modalist interpretation of the nature of God that then is revised. There are still vestiges of it. Mosiah 15 is another one of them. But it's revised. And when is it revised? It's revised, a little bit later. And we start winding up with a very different theology in the Lectures on Faith in the mid 1830s. And then we wind up with later the Book of Abraham stuff that really starts to come out in the 1840s, and a more kind of robust plurality of God's idea, and so on and so forth, into some really wild stuff, even wilder stuff in Brigham Young's tenure with the Adam God doctrine, and that then finally sort of gets settled in the early 20th century by James E. Talmage at the direction of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to kind of reconfigure into what sort of what I grew up understanding about the nature of God and the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And, a little bird tells me that there might even be further, the theological work of Blake Ostler, right? They're sort of pushed to maybe go in yet another direction.
I wanted to give either of you guys an opportunity at this point to take a break if you need to. We've been going for about an hour and a half, so we can either do that or keep going along. It's up to you guys.
I'm good.
Yeah, I'm fine too. We can keep going.
Cool. Let's get to our next super chat. This one, get Don Bradley on the show. He has the facts. You guys know who Don Bradley is?
I don't. You know who'd be a really good person to get on? I'm sure Mr. Bradley has all the facts, as been here, done that, affirms. And he's certainly not going to approach the question from a Catholic or a Christian perspective. But I was actually interested to see today, as I was refreshing up on a few things, and I watched. I had not seen that Dan Vogel put out a response video to Jacob Hanson's defense of the Book of Abraham, and it is absolutely brutal, and touched on a lot of the points. I think, Cameron, you and I discussed some of these in a phone call once, of some of the tactics that get used, of like a lot of times. And I think it's a huge credit to Ethan. Really, I can't say enough about the work that you've done. From my perspective, as somebody who was LDS and who's been pretty well versed in a lot of this stuff, you have a grasp and a work with primary sources that is unusual or uncommon among non-LDS interlocutors. And that's hard, because a lot of Catholics, for instance, they'll get into debate. People can just start throwing out kind of arcane references to cast doubt on certain arguments, and don't know what the Mormon apologist is sort of up to. But like, none of that will get by Dan Vogel in even for a second. And he's really, really good. I think it would be quite fascinating to have him debate one of these fellows.
Okay, let's move. So we have an opportunity at this point. We can keep going through some clips, or we can discuss some other topics that we haven't discussed yet. What would you guys like to do? Some more clips?
Yeah, how about we do a couple more clips?
Sure.
Okay. One of the things that I wanted to do,
we haven't trod on already, but
yeah, well, kind of what I wanted to do at this point, because we've talked about Stafford a lot, and because I think it's like such a strong argument that was brought up in your first cross exam, Ethan, I was thinking about playing the rest of that clip, the rest of the Stafford, because it really his only pushback was on the alleged lying of the Staffords about the laziness of the Smith family. So we can play that and then turn to some other clips. Let's do that.
Or actually, I think we probably one thing we should return to that I wanted to get to earlier that we haven't focused on as much, and wasn't as much of a focus of the later debates, is like, what was the original version of the story that Joseph Smith told about how he discovered the golden plates from which he supposedly translated the Book of Mormon. So that is something, actually, if that's okay with you, Cameron, if I could lay that out in more detail.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So basically, the situation that we have is a little bit complex, because the situation is we're trying to figure out when is the earliest time that somebody outside of the Smith family heard Joseph Smith claim that he had received the golden plates from an angel and that he had received a prophetic calling. And so he was called to be a prophet of God, as he would later claim in 1832 and in his official history in 1838. And then we're trying to say, does that reflect? Did he tell a different story before then about the context in which he received the golden plates? And so that requires us to keep track of two separate variables, right? When people are giving us testimony, when they're saying they received it from Joseph. So one thing that doesn't matter at all, but Mormon apologists will often obfuscate by saying this, is that yes, we can totally prove that Joseph Smith was making the later claims by the time basically you were well into the Book of Mormon translation project in 1828 and 1829. So we know he was making the claim by then. Now, even those sources, as I mentioned earlier, don't at all correspond to the story that he's going to tell in 1832. They seem to reflect the fact that still he just has like a desire for money and power, and he views these supposed divine revelations, even within this version of the story, as ways that he's going to become rich and powerful and gain dominion over Palmyra. So that's even the version that we're witnessing to there. And all that's mentioned there is an angel of the Lord. No mention of Moroni, no mention of prophetic calling, nothing like that. He's just received divine knowledge from an angel of the Lord, that version of the story. So we know he's made that up by the time the Book of Mormon translation project is well underway in 1828. So then we have a question, which is, okay, what story was the Smith family telling before 1828? And so this is where Willard Chase's affidavit is really important, because there's not going to be much value after the influences of hearing everybody tell a million stories a million ways, both Mormons tell it and everybody else tell it. There's not going to be much value in super late reminiscences that are coming in the 1880s, right? And obviously there's no value in anything in the like Kelly interviews that Mormons are going to cite, which has the same problems that were all detailed earlier with the Stafford Son testimony from those Kelly interviews. So the Chase testimony is the best we've got, because it's saying, here's what Joseph Sr. said in 1827 about the plates and how they were originally discovered. And we see that it doesn't have the religious content of the later narrative. Instead, it has the complete folk magic context. So he basically receives a revelation at the hill he's to go to. He goes, he basically finds the plates. They're supposed to be, he has to go and he has to follow all these sort of arbitrary rules where he dresses in black and he rides a black horse. And he goes and he finds, a toad who turns into the spirit of a deceased prophet who beats him and tells him to return in a year with his brother Alvin. And then he can receive them again. But he failed to follow instructions this time, so he doesn't receive the plates then. So the toad is a marker of the treasure guardian being an evil spirit. And the story is very overtly folk magical at this point, to where it's a treasure guardian rather than an angel of the Lord. Okay, in the Willard Chase version that's being told in 1827. So if Willard Chase is not fabricating this testimony, then it's going to be very overwhelming evidence that the treasure guardian version antedates the angel of the Lord version that we have witnesses to in like the 1828 period. Because it's both a good combination of being early and it's saying to have heard it early right at the commencement of the Book of Mormon translation project. So then we ask, okay, are there really good reasons to think that Willard Chase's testimony is accurate, right? And yes, there is, or at the very least that he's not fabricating it. So the first is just a very basic detail of the testimony, which is who he's claiming to have heard it from. Now, if you were freely inventing it, you just say, I heard it straight from the horse's mouth, Joseph Smith. But instead, he says he heard it from Joseph Smith Sr., right? And so if he's freely inventing it, there's no reason why he would attribute it to Sr. and make it more indirect rather than to Joseph Smith. So if he's just freely making stuff up, it already doesn't make sense. It also doesn't make sense that he would ascribe any religious content to it at all. Why say it's the spirit of the deceased prophet rather than just making it a straight up evil spirit treasure guardian? And there's lots of similar arguments that can be made where within the account, it doesn't bear the marks of fabrication because it seems to retain details that you wouldn't just make up to enhance the credibility of your attack on Joseph. The second thing that makes it very credible, besides just it being early and we having lots of character testimony to the veracity of William Stafford, is that we have so much credible testimony early on that there was a general awareness that the Smiths had not told the story about the angel or the prophetic calling. And so I already mentioned earlier that the Palmyra Reflector newspaper is saying it, but we've also just got tons and tons of independent testimonies witnessing to the fact that people knew the Smiths were constantly telling contradictory stories and that their stories were changing and evolving over time. And we can see it even within the development of the Smith's own narrative, where within the versions of the story that we have directly from Joseph, we can see the story changing dramatically over time to just strip away folk magic elements and to add in more and more religious elements. And then finally, we can just see that there's all these undesigned coincidences, both with other testimonies, which seem to show how the story transmutated between 1827 and 1828, depending on the rhetorical needs of the Smith family, but also anchoring it back, where a big key part of Willard Chase's story is that he was told to return with his brother Alvin a year later. And then it just so happens that we can prove, based on contemporaneous newspapers, that Alvin's body was dug up 3 days after the anniversary of the golden plate discovery. And the reason why was to refute rumors that the Smith family had already done so in the days prior. Now, notice how much sense of this that Willard Chase's testimony makes, which is that if everybody knew that there was a scheduled appointment between the Smiths where they were supposed to go to this hill with Alvin, but Alvin had died beforehand, it would be totally make perfect sense for people to make up a rumor that, oh, I bet they're keeping the appointment the only way that they can by digging up Alvin and then bringing him to the spirit. And so then it makes perfect sense that there would be this coincidence of timing and this otherwise bizarre thing where there's apparently credible rumors that the Smith family have dissected their own son, right? So Willard Chase, we're going through and we're seeing in a million different ways that his testimony seems to be anchored in fact rather than a fabrication. But if that's true, it means that the prophetic calling and the angel were completely anachronistic. They were just made up later, and that he initially received it from a treasure guardian.
So it looks like we've got an LDS in the chat. This guy just takes the people that hate Joseph Smith as gospel. Is that what you're doing, Ethan?
No. So, I mean, I just laid out extensive arguments for why all these things are not fabrications and why they're so basically it seems like what you're doing is basically just presupposing that Joseph Smith must be telling the truth. So let's throw out all the standards for source criticism that we would use in literally any other context.
Yeah, I don't quite, I'm trying to think if I don't have a good one off the top of my head, which they may not like this, but of, an account or something of that time that I don't think is accurate, right? That somebody said that I think is like inaccurate. But there are lots of other examples from Mormon history that come to mind. And so one is, right, there's just to mention, right, there's a story of Joseph Smith being dragged from his home and almost castrated in the middle of the night. And the event definitely happened, and there was a doctor there to castrate him. The reasons for it, like, there are some people who asserted it was because an argument that Joseph Smith was having a dalliance with the younger sister of the guy who wanted him castrated. I think that's false. I don't think there are some arguments for it, but it doesn't match up. It doesn't work. It's not true. That's not why that happened. Conversely, like, something that you like don't see a lot from LDS apologists is, favorable sources sometimes can have people who are favorable to Joseph Smith and to the claims of the LDS Church can be wrong about certain things and right about certain things in the same document. And one good example is in Lucy Mack's 1845 history, when she talks about Joseph Smith when he's a young boy getting is it typhoid? He gets sick and he gets an infection in his leg, and they call a doctor. And in her accounting of it, she says that she intervened before they amputated his leg and said, "Hey, can't you just take out the infected part or whatever, the diseased part of the bone? Don't cut off his whole leg," and that's what they do. But as people point out, the doctor who they called, who was from Dartmouth, was nationally renowned for having pioneered this very particular and novel surgical technique to be able to remove only an infected part of the bone and not the entire bone. So pretty obviously, right, like she's wrong about it. It's very implausible that Lucy Mack Smith came up with the idea to do this. It doesn't mean that the event didn't happen. It did happen. This event did happen in Joseph Smith's life. She's wrong about one particular thing for one reason, right? Emma Smith is credible on some things, and she's pretty not credible on others. The most significant of them being polygamy, because right there are lots of instances of where Emma Smith is denying that Joseph Smith taught polygamy, and this comes up in debates with the RLDS Church as they're sort of having this fight with the Brighamites out in Utah who claim Joseph Smith taught them all this, and Emma Smith is used to say, "Oh no, Joseph never taught this." Well, if we think about the various reasons that Emma Smith might not want to publicly admit something that embarrassing and difficult for her, it's pretty obvious, right? But the greater historical record is undeniable that Joseph Smith was engaged in polygamy, and so that particular statement she makes is incredible. Nothing about any of the statements that all of these affiants make suggests that the Book of Mormon initially came out in anything other than this treasure-seeking occult context. And even from friendly sources, right? Lucy Mack Smith, when she recounts it, is like, "Oh, this was super important to us. We did this stuff. We didn't go out of hand. We still did our duty and tried to take care of ourselves and worked our farm and these kinds of things." But I just don't think it's useful or helpful to just say, "Oh, you just believe everything negative about Joseph Smith that anybody said about him." That's just not true. I mean, case in point, like, I haven't seriously entertained the argument that it's all demonic until I started hearing Ethan's argument. I've largely been an adherent to Dan Vogel's pious fraud theory, because I think there's a lot of evidence that Joseph Smith sincerely believed a lot of the things eventually that he taught. But Ethan's given me things to think about.
Yeah, one other point that we talked about earlier as we were preparing is the fact that you can sincerely be demonically influenced. You can sincerely believe what is being revealed to you through demonic forces or whatever. You can be sincere about that. So they're not incompatible propositions.
No, right. As I pointed out, right? Does anyone doubt the sincerity of most people who were going to the Oracle at Delphi to inquire, what the Sibyl had to say about the will of the gods? Those people really, really believed it. From a Christian perspective, this was demonic, right? The two things are not incompatible at all.
Let's do another super chat real quick that came in a little bit earlier. This one for Jeremy. How do Mormons deal with the dilemma caused by using the Catholic New Testament canon?
Well, I think it's a little nuanced. So as they affirm in their articles of faith, they believe the Bible to be the Word of God as long as it's translated correctly, and they also believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God. And so notice the difference between those two points, right? That traditionally they affirm the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, period, and the Bible to be the Word of God insofar as it's translated correctly. And Mormonism takes of a pretty deep history of casting doubt on the authenticity of the Bible, that it was correctly, the Book of Mormon says that many great and plain truths that were in the Bible were taken out or hidden or obfuscated. And the reason I think it's relevant is that as a rhetorical or argumentative standpoint from apologists, this gives them a certain sort of leeway to get around that problem, right? That your canon exists because the Catholic Church said this is the canon. They'll sort of say, no, well, they kind of accidentally get this point right, but even what they got right in terms of what books are in the canon, and that's just the New Testament. They obviously reject that. They adopt the same canon of the Old Testament as Protestants do. But there's always this little bit of wiggle room. I think that's, a sort of conspiratorial based argument that's very hard to refute, right? Because you prove a negative that no one ever did that. But I suppose, the refutation would be, I think, you might know this better from your interactions with Dr. Craig, that in terms of the reliability of the New Testament, even, high criticism biblical scholars are fairly confident that that the text of the New Testament is like in the 99% of what we have of the text of the New Testament today, and say a critical manuscript based edition accurately represents what was initially penned.
Yeah, I think it is a pretty substantial problem too, because I mean, once you get familiar with the canon disputes and which books were disputed early on, and then the non-canonical works that didn't make it in, like the Shepherd of Hermas, First Clement.
Yeah.
How do you discern what the actual canon is? And then you just somehow trust that they accidentally got it correct.
Yeah. Well, maybe accidentally is not fair. Like, I suppose the kind of most charitable take that LDS teaching gives to the great apostasy is that, God still loves everybody who's on the earth during this time period, and that some truth, remains here and there for the benefit of mankind on the earth during the point of the great apostasy. And they could say that, God superintending the general reliability of the canon is sort of one of these instances, but the sort of general reliability of which books are in the canon don't get to the the quote unquote fullness of the gospel, or priesthood authority.
Ethan, do you have any thoughts on this super chat?
Well, I do think it's less of a problem for Mormons than it is for Protestants, just because, I mean, first, they accept that there is like a church that has normative authority, right? And then second is they believe in ongoing revelation, right? So they don't believe the canon is closed, right? And so the situation that they find themselves in is much more analogous to the Jews in the Old Testament period, where they're having continuous ongoing revelation, and they're also still kind of actively discerning the canon constantly. But I mean, I think another thing that's relevant that we kind of haven't mentioned in connection with this is like Joseph Smith produces his own translation of the Bible, which is basically like a lightly redacted version of the King James Bible. And one thing that I think is a huge problem for Mormons is that like we gain more and more manuscript evidence about what the New Testament looked like, what the Old Testament looked like as time passes since Joseph Smith produced the Joseph Smith translation. And it's like, and we continue to do text criticism, and there's no changes that he's making that seem at all supported by historical evidence concerning what the autographs of these documents actually said, right? And so it just seems like it's like a manifestly false revelation once you understand. Like, if there was reliable transmission of the autographs of the New Testament or the autographs of the Old Testament, or at the very least that the Joseph Smith translation contains accretions that we would have expected to have been retained. So like, and a lot of these would tend to be sticky if they were part of the autograph rather than edited out. Then it seems extremely problematic that he's producing this translation and then putting it forward as if he's basically correcting the Bible.
Yeah, I think their response to that too is, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible is like, hey, this is like a not really totally finished project. I mean, I remember from my experience, like it doesn't hold. It's not. If somebody correct me, if there's an LDS person in the chat, please correct me. It's been a while. It's not part of the canon. Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, right, is the canon and the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, but not the Joseph Smith translation. And so I think while I do think it's correct, I think Ethan's points are right. Substantively, they're not going to put the Joseph Smith translation on the level of the Book of Mormon.
Technicalities. on the canonization, because I mean they do regard it as like an inspired aid rather than a strictly canonical work.
Right.
But like part of the reason why it's not strictly canonical is first is that he didn't finish it, so it was only partial, right? But then we can still just say, well, there's supposedly inspiration and revelation that's perfectly analogous to what's happening with the text that you do regard as canonical, right? That's happening with this text. So even
Right.
if it isn't canonized because the project is incomplete, like it was totally en route to canonization, and there's perfect parity between it and all your canonized works. It would still be problematic if you proved the Book of Abraham was like a complete mistranslation or forgery, right? It would be problematic even if they had never gotten around to canonizing it, right? Let's say Joseph Smith didn't
Yeah.
finish it, but he was making all the claims he was making, and it was 80% done, and they didn't canonize it. It would still be extremely problematic that it was a forgery that he was translating, and it would cast doubt on the veracity of all the rest of the claims to inspiration and revelation that he made. And so the Joseph Smith translation is similarly problematic with regards to the credibility of Smith, even if it technically doesn't have the same central status
Yeah.
as something like the Book of Mormon.
Although I would qualify parts of the Joseph Smith translation technically are canon, because that is what, like the Book of Moses in the LDS Pearl of Great Price was a product of the Joseph Smith translation, but it was sort of a like extrapolation of like, oh, here's stuff that was lost from the Bible. So it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, it took Joseph Smith to give us that ending of Genesis 50. Fortunately, we recovered it though. Cheesehead Eric says, "Please tell Jeremy that he was
all
among
the
the most."
rabbis forgot about it. That
Yeah.
big, glaring, conspicuous prophecy of this guy that nobody ever talks about or mentions until that guy shows up.
So, okay, this one was a really nice comment. Please tell Jeremy that he was among the most powerful instruments our Lord used to bring me home to Rome after leaving Mormonism. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Cheesehead Eric. That's very meaningful. I appreciate that.
Did you say cheese hitter? It's cheesehead.
Cheesehead Eric. Cheesehead Eric. Sorry. It's getting late. I'm an old man. Late running this stuff.
Yeah, we're gonna wrap up here soon. How did the LDS square the plan of Sal and Matthew 22:30?
Someone remind me what Matthew 22:30 says.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull it up now.
I'll admit I was a better scriptorian in my LDS days than I am in my Catholic days, because we're not allowed to read the Bible. But
here, let me see if I can pull it up here.
I think it's the verse about people will neither be married nor given in marriage, but will be as the angels in heaven.
Yes,
So
that's the exact one.
The problem is their whole eternal marriage.
The concept of eternal marriage, yeah. I think generally the apologetic or the kind of way is like, well, what this means is that you don't get married in heaven, and that's true in LDS teaching. Like you don't once you're in heaven, not the spirit world as an in between place after you die, where LDS people could still do temple ordinances, including marriage, on your behalf vicariously, that you could then accept. But once we get to the second coming, the end of the world, nobody gets married in heaven. It's sort of done. That's their kind of read of that. I mean, I don't. I think that's a problem. If I'm remembering right, the context in which our Lord is responding, the LDS answer to that doesn't actually answer the hypothetical of the Sadducees, right? So, because their point is who's married to this woman in the resurrection.
There's two key problems with it, where the first key problem is that the immediate context in which this is uttered by our Lord is a question. It's basically a puzzle that's meant to trap our Lord, right? Or to trip him up.
Yep.
It's being posed by the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. And they're coming and they're saying, based on this practice of levirate marriage, we're going to keep marrying off this woman basically every single time these guys die off, right?
Yeah.
And
Ad
so then
infinitum
who's she
until
gonna,
there's no more brothers left.
right? And so it's seven people we go through, and then we say, okay, which of them is she going to be married to in heaven? Or is there going to be polyandry in heaven, which would be a
Well,
problem because I guess
we
polyandry.
know Joseph Smith's answer, so.
See, you can see the problem is even the reductio that the Sadducees are proposing is that polyandry in heaven would be absurd, right? Which is a
Right.
premise our Lord doesn't even challenge, but then gets later taken up by Joseph. But so then our Lord's response is, he says, there is neither marriage, nor will they be given in marriage, but they will be as the angels in heaven. So first is, just based on Gricean maxims for how you interpret any sentence, we want to make it to where if we can, our Lord is actually responding to the question and is giving them an answer that is relevant. And so the solution is that nobody's going to be married. That's the solution. So who's she going to be married
Right.
to? Nobody, because nobody's married in heaven. That's the solution. So that's the first problem, is just their reading of it, where there'll be no new marriages. Nobody will be married, but there'll be anybody who is sealed, well, they will be married. But, well, first is that wouldn't answer the actual question
It
that's
wouldn't
being
solve
posed.
the problem.
Right.
It wouldn't solve the problem of who she's going to be married to, right? But then the second, or nor the general principle, but the second is, as the angels in heaven. Well, so as the angels in heaven, is he really saying you'll be like the angels in heaven in that the angels in heaven don't have marriage ceremonies, but you'll be unlike the angels in heaven in that you'll actually be married? In response to the question of who you'll be married to in heaven, the respect in which we'll be similar to angels is not that we're unmarried, but instead that angels don't have marriage ceremonies. But the respect in which we will be dissimilar from angels is that we will in fact be married.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
That's a succinct way of putting it. Okay, let's get to our last super chat, and then we'll close things out. How can Fatima be used as an apologetic against false prophet revelation in Mormonism? How can this be done without presupposing Roman Catholicism?
I'll leave that to our resident Fatima expert.
No, I think what really needs to be done with this is just, let's do a side-by-side comparison of the Fatima seers, the Fatima miracles, and the fruits of Fatima, and then do a side-by-side comparison of that with early Mormonism, right? So we look at who are the seers, and we say, oh, they have inspired sanctity. They're willing to suffer martyrdom rather than tell a lie, even a lie that's going to save them and get them out of persecution and prevent them from being killed by this hostile local administrator. They're doing penance and self-sacrifice. They're not seeking out money. They're not seeking out sex. Like Lucia goes and she just is in the cloister as a nun, giving up all money, giving up all power, giving up all fame, giving up all sex for the rest of her life. And this is who our Lord is setting aside to be the apostle of this Fatima message, who's reporting recurring private revelations. We see that rather than it being that we have these like vague testimonies, like the testimonies of the 3 and the testimonies of the 8, where like with the 3, they're not even telling you like the date, time, location, when this event occurred, and they're having to stitch together 2 completely unrelated experiences. With Fatima, it's a pre-announced schedule of group experiences that are occurring separated at literally, and you're having 6 separate occurrences where you're having group multimodal experiences that are scheduled, all contemporaneously documented. And then you're having massive public signs, right? 100,000 people are witnessing it. It's corroborated by physical evidence, predicted in advance when it was going to occur to promulgate a message that confirms Catholicism. And then you're having 15,000 healings that are all corroborated by medical testimony going forward. So we have morally impeccable prophetesses, okay? We have extremely credible contemporaneous documentation of super impressive group experiences on a pre-announced schedule. We're having predicted in advance colossal miracles and tons of medically documented extraordinary healings to confirm it. And we're contrasting that with the constant excuses and ad hoc rationalizations that we're having to make for, okay, why can't we even get the 3 testimony statement not to be a misleading composite of 2 completely separate visionary experiences with a group of people who all have visionary backgrounds, who are going to be perjurers, who are schizophrenics, who are going to announce false prophecies, who we've got these guys who are going to commit all these crimes and who have demon worship in their rap sheet. It's just terrible. And they have no, and even though this is the fullness of the truth that's going to restore the gospel to the world, they have literally nothing even remotely as comparable to Fatima, even though I can list 10 giant, colossal Catholic miracles that have similarly amazing evidence as Fatima. It's just ridiculous that the most privileged religion is going to have this terrible of a record comparatively.
Yeah, I think we'll end things there. This has been a lot of fun. I mean, as the nature of these things go, there's always 10 more clips we could have watched, there's 10 more things we could have done, but that's just how the night went on. So what you can do in the chat, in the comments, is let me know what you'd like to see more of. If you'd like to see us come back together, talk about some other subjects within Mormonism, or maybe expand out, just let me know. And we'll get on it. But in the meantime, Ethan and Jeremy, I appreciate you guys spending some time with me this evening. Jeremy, I appreciate you sitting through the debate and watching it. I think you said you watched, what, 30% of it?
Yeah, I think about 30%.
Yeah, no, this has been great. So I appreciate both of you guys joining.
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Yeah, don't forget to follow Jeremy over on X. He's going to be doing some more stuff over there, I think, right? You're going to be posting more, doing things?
Yeah, I post all the time.
Nice. Yeah. Oh, and then I can mention Ethan too, I guess. Go follow him on Substack. He's got a Substack. Anyways, it's late. We're going to head out. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next one.
Bye.
God bless.